So, on the question of are Americans more divided than they used to be, the answer is kind of yes and no. Of course, our country's experienced a civil war, so people can be more divided. And historically, when you look at certain periods of time over the last 100 years, even, there have been periods where Americans are deeply divided. In 1968, the Democratic National Convention was rocked by massive protests against the Vietnam War, and with the younger half of the generation saw as a kind of capitulation to more conservative values. Their favorite, more liberal candidate, Bobby Kennedy, had just been assassinated, and so the Democratic Party was nominating a much more conservative, older, and supposedly out of touch nominee to run against a much more conservative president in Richard Nixon. That may sound a little familiar to today. Now, it's important to remember when we look at the voting population based on the results of the 2016 election, the most recent presidential election, the biggest proportion of registered voters didn't vote. So more people didn't vote than voted for Donald Trump or who voted for Hillary Clinton. Now, both parties know that. They're very aware. And they know that when it comes to getting more voters, instead of, for example, the Democrats trying to appeal to Trump voters and trying to convince them to vote Democrat, which they know is very unlikely, it's easier to appeal to these people who didn't vote, right? Because they can guess that roughly half of these people, if you were to draw a line right in the middle, probably if they did vote, would lean Democrat. And they weren't inspired to vote by whatever reason. So it's easier to try to convince those people to vote, either by convincing them that you have something to offer them, right? Which for, say, the Democratic Party, for example, it's hard because a lot of these people say we're Bernie Sanders supporters that are much farther to the left, that don't see anything in Clinton or Biden, or maybe they were people that felt that they should be more conservative but really didn't like Donald Trump. Either way, they have to capitulate and try to entice those voters. That usually means going more to the extremes. The same is true of the Republicans, right? So they have a large portion of these people that maybe would have voted Republican but didn't like Trump, or maybe they just couldn't be inspired to vote, or maybe they just didn't like the Republican Party platform. But one of the easiest ways to convince them to vote for your party is to say, hey, okay, you might not like us, you might not like it that much or enough to vote, but remember, if you're voting for us, you're voting against the other person. You're voting against them. So if you can't convince them, say this half of people that would lean Democrat, to vote Democrat, you can at least convince them that they really don't want the opposition, and so they should vote anyway against the opposition. So that's how both parties end up appealing to these non-voters by trying to trash the other side, and thus we are pushed to greater polarization. I want you to watch the next two videos. They're hosted on Schoology. They are going to give a great example of the way that our country has become more polarized and people have seen their political opponents differently over the last 20 to 30 years or so.